What ancient creature lurked in this 18th century cave? Welcome to the Owa. Oh, that was very dark. Well, I'm trying something new. Aside from having a new cutting mat, I'm also using my voice for the first time. A little bit out of my comfort zone, if I'm honest, but let me know in the comments if you like me to keep doing voiceovers or you want me to keep my mouth shut in future videos. For this diorama, I wanted to explore the Indian Wars in 18th century North America. Only this time, the Native Americans won't be fighting the British or French or any other colonists. They'll be facing a long-forgotten ancient evil, which they accidentally awakened. In this story, a group of Eastern Woodland Native Americans camps out near a dark and mysterious cave in the mountains. And one of them decides to explore that cave, and barely makes it out alive. And while one of them is helping his comrade, asking what happened, the other two look toward the cave and see something. And what they'll be seeing starts with this very ancient evilly looking skull of a Hoplophoneus, which I found on the Sketchfab page of the Badlands Dinosaur Museum. They have a really cool collection of fossils they can print for free. And since Hoplophoneus roamed North America about 35 million years ago, that definitely qualifies as ancient. So I printed one on my 3D FDM printer. Now normally this distant cousin of the saber-toothed tiger was about the size of a German shepherd. But that's where the evil part comes in. Bigger is badder. To get them out too close, I separated from the skull and then I coated everything in a layer of UV resin to get rid of the layer lines. This doesn't always work. I wouldn't use it on very small, high-detailed prints, but for organic shapes, this is a great option. To make any glue and paint adhere a little bit better, I gave the model a coat of grey primer and then I broke out my kitbashing tools. I wanted the creature to be half mechanical and half organic, and this camera lens I took from a toy drone was a great starting point. After bulking out the eye sockets with tinfoil, I glued the lens in place and protected it with masking tape to prevent scratches. For the first layer of mechanics, I started sculpting with Milliput. This is just a very basic background of some metal plating and some rivets, and since Milliput takes a fair amount of time to cure, it's also easy to press fit any other kitbashing elements for some added detail. For a large mechanical jaw, I started with a flat surface that I covered in thin sheets of polystyrene paneling. There's no real plan here. I drew a lot of different panels and decided on the go which ones would fit. And I also added some small styrene tubes and some electrical parts for additional detail. By now you might have also noticed that I'm only working on one side of the skull. And that's on purpose. The skull will be looking out from a cave and will be glued to the backside of that cave, and there will simply be no way you'll ever see the other side. Unless you break it, which I don't intend to. After my skull looked menacing and angry enough, it was time to give it a little fur. I used some super fine Milliput and applied that to all the parts where I didn't want either the skull or the mechanical parts to show. I could then very easily draw in the fur lines with a plastic sculpting tool and smoothen everything out a little with a brush dipped in water. And now I had something that looked like an ancient evil gerbil, because I completely forgot to give it ears. Small oversight, but easily amended. I even gave it 2, for good measure. I filled some seam lines on the minis with some leftover Milliput, and that was my creature building completely almost done. You'll see why. And it was time to move on to the base. I used the wooden base of this picture frame to hold down a piece of XPS foam I had cut off camera. I debated for quite some time whether I was going to use the original frame as well, and ultimately I decided not to. But you might still see it pop up here and there in this video. After sketching a rough layout, I started stacking pieces of XPS foam to create the cave and the surrounding rocks. I added some support pillars to hold up the roof, but I made sure the cave was still open on the backside so that I would still have access to it. Next, I needed to make this XPS foam look not like XPS foam, so I started carving away with multiple tools until I had something that looked like limestone. Limestone is naturally layered since it forms from centuries of natural sediments and sea life, and over time some parts erode faster than others, which gives it that natural striped and rigid look. After all my cutting, dremeling, scraping, the easiest way to achieve realistic texture is just beating it up with an actual limestone. I was originally going to keep the cave low and just keep the top part cut off, but when I looked at that flintstone house I just made, I decided to repeat the whole process with some extra XPS foam on top. Finally, I added some toothy rocks, which made the whole diorama a bit more menacing, and I got rid of some fuzz with a butane torch. I whipped up something that resembles sculpt mold, but it's actually just ground down egg cartons, plaster of Paris and a little water. But it does the trick just fine. After applying that to all the seams in the rocks, I also spread it over on the ground to add a little more variation, and I let everything dry overnight. Once that was completely dry, I used this mix of leftover Modpodge, paint and water, and I sealed the entire diorama in it to protect it from paints later on. The muddy ground got the same treatment, only this was a mix of Modpodge, water, paint and a little plaster. And I spread that all over the ground or any ground texture-like area with my gloved finger. I wanted the diorama to have a little bit more of a camping vibe, so while this was drying, I broke out my Super Sculpey and sculpted a wide array of camping supplies. Things like rugs or a blanket, a tanning hide, meat on a roasting spit, some bowls, just anything I can think of. Oh, and what I also thought about was sculpting a paw for my creature, so now it's finally really done. Meow. After I cleaned up the sides of the diorama with some thin polystyrene sheets, it was time to do a big texture pass. I started out with this muddy earth by AK Acrylics, which I smoothed out over the floor with a little water, and I also drew in some mud lines leading towards the cave opening to get a more menacing dynamic. And once everything was muddy to my satisfaction, I started layering in pebbles of various sizes, but also these wood chips that I grounded up in an old coffee grinder, which make a really nice forest floor at this scale. I sealed everything in with a mix of PVA glue, water and isopropyl alcohol, and then I created a teeny tiny campfire with some smaller rocks made from XPS foam and a little bit of wood chips. And whatever nice wood chip I would still find in my baggie I would use as a fallen tree stump or some dead wood just to breathe more realism into the diorama. Last step was to press in some footprints coming out of the cave, and then I primed everything black for painting. Oh, I wish it were that easy. I first gave the rocks a base coat with different kinds of grey, moving a little lighter with every coat. I also added some warm sandy yellow streaks in the most eroded part of the limestone. After that I made some acrylic washes in various colors, because rocks are never just grey, even though they would appear so. There's always some color bleeding through, and even though they're very subtle in the end, adding these colors now will leave you with a much more realistic result. After that I did the same for the soil but with various brown shades, with lighter brown shades guiding the eye towards the cave opening. These washes are made with oil paints and mineral spirits, or white spirit if you're European like me. I mixed a black oil wash for the rocks and burnt umber for the soil. Oil washes do take a while to dry, but once that was done, I brought back the highlights with a dry brush. Next, it was time to breathe some green into this diorama. I airbrushed thin coats of green around the shadowy parts and the parts with all the dead wood to give those areas a more mossy appearance. For the thicker moss, I sprinkled in some green turf on patches of Modpodge, and I held those in place with a spritz of isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension of the glue. And after a quick shake-off, I repeated the process with a static grass applicator to create some grassy patches. These nylon fibers are notoriously bad for your lungs, by the way, so I protected myself with the awesome power of a dirty sock on a vacuum and a respirator. And with that important safety disclaimer out of the way, here's a tip on how to make your own vines. Just pull apart some Sisal cord and give that a bath in Modpodge, paint and water. Next, twist the strands together to your desired thickness and leave them somewhere to dry. You can also dump them in individually if you don't want to make a hot mess like I did, but the result is pretty much the same. Once dry, they still remain a little flexible, so they're very easy to bend around and glue in place on the diorama. A little sealing with my PVA glue, water and isopropyl mix, and then I brushed in some edge highlighting to blend in the branches a little better. I originally wanted to coat these vines in these medium bushes, but they just didn't look real enough for me. However, their tiny leaves did. So I shook them out of the package and sprinkled those gently over the vines. With the vines securely in place, I followed up with some sea foam, which I first painted brown, and then I dipped them in some green flocking. And the result were these tiny bushes, which I scattered all over the diorama. And the final, but maybe most important step are the small details. So I added a variety of little tufts and shrubs. I tied everything together with various greens from the airbrush and some brown oil washes. Painted in the campfire to make it look extinguished, and finally I stippled in some small lichens on the rocks, and it's done, finally. Time to paint the characters of this world. The first thing I had to do was protect the glass of the creature's eye with some liquid mask. Off camera, I also sculpted a few extra more interesting props like this water bottle and basket. I glued all the tiny details to makeshift painting handles, and then I primed everything black, followed by a white zenithal highlight. I started with the creature and first gave the skull a warm undertone with some yellow ochre and a beastly brown along the teeth and in the shadow areas. Then I followed up with very thin layers of bone white until I got a realistically looking bone color. I gave the fur various shades of brown, and then I drew in some dark blackish stripes. I don't know if Hoplophoneus actually had these, but maybe this one is an ancient zebra tiger gerbil Hoplophoneus. If you know, or you were there 35 million years ago, tell me in the comments if I got it right-ish or very wrong. After I used the brush to do some fine detailing and a dry brush to bring back the highlights in the fur, I painted the mechanical details in gunmetal and then used a dry brush with some silver and another dry brush with some more rusty colors to make everything seem more ancient. Lastly, a burnt umber oil wash tied everything together and I could peel off the liquid mask, and that was my ancient creature done, and I could move on to the minis. Now there are far better miniature painters in the world than I am, so I'm not gonna bore you with all the details, but while I paint these, I can maybe say a word or two about my work. I really do like exploring alternate dimensions, alternate worlds or outworlds, and I particularly enjoy learning about other cultures and their history and incorporating that into my work. You might have seen my video around the Ronin bot in feudal Japan, or the space jeepney, which was my take on bringing the charm, history and resourcefulness of the Philippines into the space age. It's also always a challenge because working with other cultures also means you have to understand other cultures' sensitivities, and I do try to spend a lot of attention on that. So it's always a risk. I do hope that you enjoy this video and that you see it for what it is, but also feel free to reach out to me either in the comments or send me an email to the email address in my channel information. The last thing on my to paint list were the small props. I painted a lot more than I'm eventually going to use, but I did have a lot of fun painting the deer hide, so that one's definitely going in. And with all the puzzle pieces laid out, final assembly. And that's it for this build. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Stick around for the glamour shots, and I hope to see you again in the OA.